Three brutish men left a beaten Apache girl tied to his fence post as payment for a horse. The lone rancher, Caleb Monroe, had spent the last 12 years keeping to himself on a patch of dry land outside of town like Scorpion Ridge. His only goal was to avoid other people and the trouble they dragged behind them. But trouble had just been delivered to his doorstep, bound in rope. What will this reclusive man do? And why did these men believe a human life was fair trade for a horse? If you've ever been faced with a choice you didn't ask for, stay for this story. Caleb Monroe had spent the last 12 years keeping to himself on a patch of dry Arizona land called Scorpion Ridge. He had once worked as a trail scout for army convoys and cattle outfits, his eyes sharp enough to read a story in a single broken twig. That life ended the day a raid on a caravan left his younger brother, Daniel, shot through the ribs while Caleb was too far ahead to help. After burying him under a pile of stones, he stopped taking contracts. He built a small, sturdy cabin with leftover lumber and scrap nails and worked just enough cattle to stay alive. His only goal now was to avoid other people and the trouble they invariably dragged behind them like a rattling chain. He had no wife, no family, and no crew, just the unforgiving land, 2 horses, and a rifle he rarely used unless a coyote came too close to the chicken pen. That evening, he had just filled a tin pail with water pulled from the deep well and was scraping a day's worth of mud off his boots when he heard them. Hoofbeats on the hard dirt, coming from the south trail. The rhythm was wrong, unsteady, drunk, tired, or all three. He stopped what he was doing, his body still but his senses alert, and watched the distant tree line. He considered going inside for the rifle, but knew that stepping out with a gun in hand would only stir something that was best left sleeping. He would wait. He was good at waiting. 3 riders emerged through the evening dust, their clothes stained with sweat and trail dirt, their faces unshaven and grim. One wore a cavalry coat with no insignia, a ghost of a uniform. Another had a thick, white scar that cut through his eyebrow, giving him a look of permanent anger. The third, who rode slightly in front, smelled like cheap whiskey even from a distance. Their horses were breathing hard, their flanks flecked with foam. Caleb stayed where he was, near the fence line, his expression as flat and unreadable as the desert floor. He didn't greet them. He didn't ask questions. People who arrived at your door uninvited usually brought excuses or demands, and he had no time for either. The man in front, the leader, raised a hand as if they were old neighbors dropping by for a chat. "Evening. We come for a trade," he said, his voice rough, as if it had been strained from shouting earlier in the day. Caleb didn't answer. His silence was a wall, forcing the man to keep talking, to reveal his purpose. "That bay mare of yours," the man continued, his bloodshot eyes fixing on the corral. "We were told she'd be ours after the work last spring. We're here to collect." Caleb's jaw moved once, a small, tight muscle flexing. "I don't owe you a thing," he said. His voice was steady, not raised, but it carried the weight of finality. The man just smirked, a cruel twisting of his lips, and jerked his chin toward the rider in the back. "Got payment with us." That was when Caleb noticed the rope, a dark line trailing from the saddle horn down into the dust. At the end of it, a woman walked. She was Apache, her wrists bound tightly in front of her with a rope that had left angry, red grooves in her skin. Her ankles were scraped and raw, and she was barefoot. Every step she took was shaky, as if her legs were about to give out, but with each falter, she forced them straight again, an act of sheer, stubborn will. Her long, black hair was stuck to the side of her face with a paste of dirt and sweat. The deerskin dress she wore had been ripped down the side and across the chest, exposing the top line of one breast and a series of dark, ugly bruises on her collarbone. They stopped a few yards from the fence, and the rider yanked the rope forward. She stumbled hard but didn't cry out, her head staying down, her breathing shallow and uneven. The lead man grinned, showing yellowed teeth. "Caught her stealing near the canyon. Army at Fort Grant don't want her. We figure this is a fair trade. You get her and the horse she's tied to." The man continued, his voice slick with false reason. "We get the mare, and nobody has to argue." Caleb looked from the woman, a broken but defiant figure, to the 3 men, vultures circling what they thought was an easy meal. His face didn't change, but his stomach tightened into a cold, hard knot. He knew what they wanted, a simple, Dirty transaction with no questions asked. He also knew what would happen if he refused. 3 half-sober men with guns, short tempers, and nothing to lose could destroy more than they stood to gain. A gunfight out in the open would be loud, bloody, and pointless. It would solve nothing and likely end with him in the ground next to Daniel. "I don't trade people," he said, the words tasting like rust in his mouth. The leader laughed, a short, ugly bark. "You ain't trading. You're receiving. Take the horse. She stays here. Your problem." The man's tone made it clear this was no longer a negotiation. Caleb hated giving ground, but he measured the risk. He had no backup, no neighbors to call on. Without showing a flicker of emotion, he gave a single, sharp nod toward the corral. "Take the mare and ride." They didn't thank him. 2 of the men dismounted, their movements clumsy but quick, and untied the horse he'd indicated. The 3rd man callously tied the end of the woman's rope to the fence post, treating her like a piece of luggage being dropped off. She braced her feet in the dirt and took the sharp tug of the rope without falling. When they mounted up again on their tired horses, leading his fine bay mare, one of them chuckled. "If she dies here, you can bury her or leave her for the wolves. Your problem now." They rode off, kicking up a cloud of dust that hung in the air long after the sound of their hoofbeats had faded. When they were gone, Caleb stood perfectly still for almost a full minute, the silence of the desert rushing back in. He could hear the faint, ragged rasp of the woman's breath, the whisper of the wind pushing through dry brush, and the soft creak of the rope against the fence post. He didn't go near her. He turned and walked back toward the cabin as if nothing had changed, as if his world hadn't just been violently invaded. Inside, he took off his hat and sat heavily on a wooden chair. He poured himself a cup of water from the pail and drank half of it, the cool liquid doing nothing to wash away the sour taste in his throat. He told himself she was not his responsibility. Riders from Fort Grant crossed this land from time to time. They'd either see her and take her, or they wouldn't. Either way, it wasn't on him. As darkness began to settle, painting the sky in shades of purple and orange, he lit a lamp and sliced a strip of salted pork for his dinner. He ate slowly, mechanically, his thoughts circling back to the last time he ignored something that wasn't his problem. That memory always ended the same way, in a shallow grave on a rocky ridge, and with his brother's blood feeling warm on his hands. He glanced through the open doorway. She was still upright, but her shoulders slumped with exhaustion. The night air was cooling rapidly, and she had no shoes, no fire, nothing but a piece of rope holding her up. She hadn't made a sound, not a whimper or a cry. An hour passed. The coyotes began to call to each other from the distant hills, their yips and howls echoing in the vast emptiness. He tried to lie down on his cot, but the image of her tied to that post was burned into his mind. He sat up on the edge of the bed and felt that familiar, sour pull in his chest. Annoyance or guilt, he wasn't sure which. He cursed once, a low, guttural sound under his breath, and stood. The decision was made. He stepped back outside into the cool night air. The wind was sharper now, carrying the scent of dust and dry sage. He walked to her without speaking. She didn't seem to notice him until his hand touched the taut rope near the post. She tensed instantly, her whole body going rigid like a startled deer, but she didn't fight or pull away. When his hand brushed against her arm, her skin was hot to the touch, radiating a dry, unhealthy heat. He saw the cracked and bleeding heels of her feet, the violent, uncontrollable shaking in her legs that she was trying so hard to conceal. The rope burns on her wrists had hardened with dried blood, a grim testament to her ordeal. He took out his knife, the worn handle familiar in his palm, and with one clean, decisive slice, he cut the rope. Her arms dropped forward, limp and useless, and she swayed on her feet, her body finally surrendering. He grabbed her before she could hit the ground, his arm wrapping around her thin waist. She weighed less than he expected, all sharp angles and tense bone, covered in a film of sweat and dirt. She didn't try to talk, didn't ask questions, her eyes half open but unfocused, seeing nothing. "I'm not keeping you," he said quietly, the words spoken more to himself than to her, an attempt to force the decision into something temporary, something manageable. He picked her up and carried her inside. It was an awkward, unfamiliar act for a man who hadn't held another person in years. Her head rested against his chest, and her tangled hair, stiff with grime, stuck to his shirt. The torn deerskin dress slipped further, but he kept his eyes fixed on the cabin door, refusing to look. He laid her gently on the spare cot, the one his brother Daniel had once used, and pulled a rough wool blanket over her. Under the steady, yellow glow of the lamplight, the extent of her injuries was starkly visible. Dark, plum-colored bruises marred her ribs and shoulder, a deep cut sliced across her thigh, and her wrists were swollen and raw. She was breathing in shallow, ragged gasps, the way people do when the body is trying to shut down and keep going at the same time. He fetched a tin cup of water and set it on the floor near the bed. He thought about asking her name, who she was, but she was already unconscious, lost in a world of fever and pain. Caleb sat down in the wooden chair again, his large frame suddenly feeling out of place in the small, quiet room. He stared at the floorboards, telling himself she'd leave as soon as she could walk. He wouldn't get involved. He wouldn't ask who she was. He wouldn't let this become another burden that cost more than it gave. But he didn't lie down. He stayed awake all night, a silent vigil in the flickering lamplight, listening to the sound of her breathing, just to make sure she was still alive. Caleb woke before the sun, the same as every morning, but the quality of the silence in the cabin was different. It wasn't the familiar, empty quiet he was used to. For a split second, he forgot she was there. Then he heard the shallow, rasping breath from the cot and remembered. He remembered carrying an unconscious Apache woman into his home after dark, an act that went against every rule he had set for himself over the past 12 years. He sat up on the edge of his own bed, rubbed the back of his neck, and listened. She hadn't moved much. The blanket still covered her shoulders, and one arm lay outside it, the wrist swollen and angry where the rope had cut deep into the flesh. He stood and crossed the room, his bare feet silent on the cool wooden floor. Questions he had pushed away the night before were now turning in his mind, sharp and insistent. Who had those men taken her from? Was there someone out there searching for her? Had the army at Fort Grant already marked her as property, or a prisoner? If he rode into the nearest town, Dust Devil Gulch, and someone recognized her, they'd assume he either stole her or bought her. Neither accusation would end cleanly. Up close, he saw the dirt caked in her hairline and the dried blood on her leg where the dress had split open above the thigh. He gently checked the cut. It wasn't deep, but it was filthy, a breeding ground for infection. Her feet were cracked and swollen, the soles dark with bruising and torn skin. No one walked in that condition for long unless they were forced, driven like an animal. He stepped back and fetched the old wash basin from the corner, filled it with water from the pail, and set it near the cot. She didn't open her eyes when the cool, damp cloth touched her forehead, but her breathing hitched, a small, involuntary reaction. He carefully cleaned the dirt and grime from her face, and then her hands, his touch surprisingly gentle as he worked around the raw, glistening rope burns. She stirred once, her lips parting as she tried to form a word, but only a dry, rasping sound escaped. He gave her a small sip of water, holding the tin cup steady at her mouth. Most of it rolled down her chin, but she managed to swallow enough to keep from choking. He didn't try to talk to her, didn't ask if she could understand his language. He focused on the practical things first, the things that needed doing. There was a small cabinet by the door where he kept his meager supplies, dry bread, coffee, and jerky. He sliced a piece of the bread into small, manageable chunks and put them in a tin bowl, leaving it within reach in case she woke up hungry. He had stitched his own cuts dozens of times and patched up men on the trail after ambushes, so tending to her wounds didn't feel strange, only inconvenient. He applied a salve to the worst of the cuts, his movements efficient and practiced. While she rested, he stepped outside to tend to the animals. The bay mare those men had taken had been one of his better horses, and the unfairness of the trade stung more now that the sun had risen and the loss felt real and tangible. The chicken pen was quiet, and a thin layer of dust already coated the water trough again. He checked the horizon out of habit, his eyes scanning the vast, empty landscape. No riders in sight. No army patrol. No fresh wagon tracks. The land was still, but stillness in the Arizona territory never lasted long. When he returned to the cabin, she was half awake, her eyes barely open. She looked at the ceiling first, her gaze slowly moving around the small room as if trying to place where she was. When her eyes finally shifted and landed on him, her face showed no panic, only a deep, profound exhaustion and a familiar caution, the kind he'd seen in animals that had been hunted for too long. If you believe a single act of compassion can change everything, please hit the like button. Her throat moved as if she wanted to speak, but she remained silent. He crouched beside the cot, keeping a respectful distance. "You can drink if you're able," he said, his voice low and even, stripped of any emotion that might frighten her. She blinked, seeming to understand the intent, if not the exact words. With a weak, trembling hand, she tried to pull the blanket up higher over her chest. The torn dress still sagged at the neckline, exposing the bruised skin near her collarbone and the top curve of one breast. She deliberately avoided his eyes as she covered herself, a small, desperate act of preserving her own dignity. He stood and brought her the bowl of bread, setting it on the floor beside her. "You eat when you can," he stated, the words a contract he was making with himself as much as with her. "Then you leave when you're able to walk." She looked at him then, her dark eyes steady, not pleading or afraid. She tried to speak again, her voice barely a breath, the words rough but clear enough to understand. "No, go." She wasn't asking for permission to stay. She was stating a refusal to leave. He didn't answer. He wasn't ready to argue with someone who couldn't even stand upright yet. Instead, he went to an old trunk and pulled out one of his own shirts. It was one of his lighter ones, worn-looking but clean. He set it at the foot of the cot. "Dress is torn. Use that when you can stand." Her gaze followed his hand, but she said nothing, closing her eyes again as if the simple act of looking cost too much strength. The question of her name, of who she was, hung unspoken in the air. He didn't ask, not because he didn't want to know, but because knowing would make her his problem, and he'd spent 12 long years making sure he had none. An hour passed before she tried to sit up. Caleb watched from the table where he was cleaning his revolver, his arms crossed over his chest. He was ready to help if she fell, but he wouldn't rush to do it. She needed to find her own strength first. She managed to brace herself on one elbow, her movements slow and deliberate, and pulled the blanket securely around her shoulders. The small motion made her flinch as the raw skin of the rope burn stretched. Her eyes fell on the tin bowl of bread on the floor, then she looked at him, a quick, assessing glance, deciding whether it was safe to eat food offered by this strange, silent man. Hunger, it seemed, won out over caution. She reached down slowly, her fingers trembling with weakness, and brought a small piece of bread to her mouth. He saw how carefully she chewed, as if swallowing too much, too fast, might make her sick. When she had finished a second piece, her voice came again, quiet and struggling through the unfamiliar landscape of limited English. "Name." He hadn't expected her to ask first. He hesitated, not out of fear, but because giving a name made things real, tangible. It created a connection, and connections were what he had sworn to avoid. "Caleb," he said finally, the name sounding strange in the quiet cabin. She nodded once, a small dip of her chin. He waited, thinking she might offer her own name in return. When she didn't, he forced himself to ask the question. "What do I call you?" She looked at the floor, then at the wall, her gaze avoiding his while she answered. "Niall." The name landed differently than he had expected. It didn't sound like the name of a stranger just passing through. It sounded like a name whose absence might be noticed elsewhere, a name that belonged to someone. That realization made his next thought heavier, more dangerous. If someone was looking for her, a person with a name like Niall, coming to this isolated cabin could bring them straight to his door, and with them, the trouble he had so carefully avoided for 12 years. He said nothing about it. He wouldn't borrow trouble before it arrived. She finished the last piece of bread and leaned back slowly against the wall, her eyelids low but not fully closed. The fever had dropped slightly, but she was still profoundly weak. He took the empty bowl and stood near the door for a moment, the vast, empty landscape stretching out behind him. "You rest now," he said, the words a command as much as a suggestion. "When you can walk, you go." She didn't nod this time. She didn't argue. She simply looked at him with the same unreadable expression she'd had when he cut the rope from her wrists. It was neither trust nor fear, just a quiet, profound endurance. He stepped outside again, into the growing heat of the day, telling himself this was temporary, that she was not staying, that he would not let another life, another person's problems tie themselves to his. But even as the sun climbed higher in the sky, he found himself listening for any sound from the cot. And every time his eyes scanned the horizon, he wasn't sure if he was hoping to see riders or praying not to. Through the late morning, the cabin stayed quiet except for the low creak of wood as the wind pushed along the walls. Caleb split firewood near the shed, the rhythmic thud of the axe a familiar comfort. He told himself he was only listening to make sure she didn't pass out or choke on a sip of water. But the truth was harder to ignore now that he had spoken her name, now that she had a name in his mind. Niall. He'd seen Apache women before in passing, at trading posts, or from a distance on the trail. He had traded with some, and in his younger days as a scout, fought against others. But he had never had one lying in his brother's bed or asking his name. When he stepped back inside, she was awake again, sitting upright with the blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders. The dirt and grime still streaked her arms and legs, and her hair hung down in a heavy, matted tangle. She had pulled his shirt into her lap, but hadn't put it on yet. She seemed to be studying the cabin, piece by piece. The cast-iron stove with its blackened pipe, the narrow wooden table, the single shelf holding 2 tin plates and a coffee pot. Her eyes didn't move fast. They swept over each thing once, slowly, as if she were committing it to memory. He filled a cup with water from the basin and handed it to her, careful that their fingers didn't touch. She took it, her hands unsteady but stronger than they had been before, and drank slowly. He watched the way she handled the water, with a controlled and careful precision, like someone who had learned from a hard life not to consume anything too fast or to waste a single drop. She didn't look at him when she finally spoke, her gaze fixed on the far wall. "Why you take me inside?" He didn't answer right away. The question was direct, not wounded or pleading, her voice rough but steady. He leaned his shoulder against the wall and crossed his arms, creating a physical barrier between them. "You would have died out there if I didn't." It was the simplest version of the truth. The rest of it, that he didn't want another memory of a person dying because of his inaction, that he didn't want another grave turning his land into a cemetery, he kept to himself. Niall lowered the cup. "Men say you take me as trade." "I didn't ask for you," he said flatly. "And I didn't want to fight 3 men over a damn horse." He didn't care if the wording was blunt. Honesty was the only thing he had left some days, the only currency he trusted. She nodded once, absorbing that information without any visible reaction. Then she pointed to her wrists, where the skin was torn and swollen. "They take me. 3 days. No food. No, speak my name." Her English was broken, but her meaning was perfectly, painfully clear. He crouched beside the cot and looked at the rope burns. They were ugly, and the risk of infection was high. He got the salve he kept for his own injuries, a thick, herbal-smelling concoction, and set the tin beside her. "For the wrists," he said. She didn't reach for it immediately. She waited until he had stepped back, creating a safe distance between them, before she uncapped the tin and began to apply the salve herself, slowly, carefully, wincing as the raw skin stung. He stayed close enough to intervene if she needed him, but he didn't move to help. When she was finished, he placed a strip of clean cloth on the edge of the bed. "Wrap them. Keep them clean." She tore the cloth into 2 pieces with her teeth and tied each wrist, her teeth gripping the ends of the knot when her fingers shook too much to pull it tight. When she finished, she picked up the shirt he had given her. "You, turn," she said quietly, motioning with her chin toward the wall. He didn't argue. He turned his back and stared out the small, dusty window while she pulled the torn deerskin dress down from one shoulder and dragged the clean shirt over her head. He heard the soft rustle of the fabric and her quiet breath as she tugged it into place. When she said, "Finished," he faced her again. His shirt hung past her thighs, the sleeves rolled up past her elbows. She had kept the blanket pulled up over her legs. The ruined dress lay in a heap on the floor, the seams thick with blood and dirt. He brought her a small plate with a piece of jerky and half an apple he had been saving. She ate the jerky first, in small, deliberate bites, chewing each one slowly. She hesitated over the apple, a simple luxury, before taking a bite. As she did, her shoulders seemed to loosen slightly, as if the taste of something clean and fresh stirred a memory of a different, better time. He finally asked the question that had been circling his mind since the night before. "You got people looking for you?" For the first time since she had been conscious, she looked directly at him. Her eyes didn't flicker or shift away. Maybe, she said, her voice flat. Maybe dead. She paused, searching for the right English words. Raid. Soldiers. I hide in rocks. Men take me when I walk for water. Her tone didn't shake. She spoke like someone remembering the weather, not a traumatic event. He absorbed the details without showing any emotion, though they complicated things far more than he wanted. If soldiers from Fort Grant had attacked her band, and those bounty riders had taken her, someone, either her people or the army, might be tracking them. He looked toward the door instinctively, sizing up the distance to his rifle. You stay until you can stand and ride, he said, his voice firm. Then you go wherever you're going. She set the apple core down on the plate and looked around the small cabin again. I go with no shoes. No horse. She wasn't pleading. She was simply observing a fact. Her feet were still cracked and swollen. Even if he forced her off his land, she wouldn't get very far. He didn't respond. Not because he didn't hear her, but because saying anything more would be making a decision he wasn't ready to make. By the time the sun slipped toward late afternoon, Caleb had exhausted the chores he normally stretched across an entire day. Work was his refuge, a physical act that usually pushed unwanted thoughts aside. But now, every task left too much room for distraction. He checked the corral fence twice, even though he knew it was empty. He poured feed for the chickens, though they were still pecking at scraps from the morning. He sharpened a hatchet that wasn't even dull. Each repetitive motion brought him circling back toward the cabin door, and each time he stopped himself from going in too soon, not wanting to seem like a jailer. When he finally pushed the door open, Niall was sitting up again, her legs covered by the blanket, his shirt hanging loose around her small frame. She had attempted to braid part of her hair, but it was still too tangled and stuck with dried blood in places. Near the cot, on the floorboards, was a small pile of dirt she had meticulously scraped from under her fingernails, a small act of reclaiming herself. She looked alert, still weak, but no longer at the fragile edge of collapse. He set down a tin cup of water and a plate with a portion of the beans and salt pork he had reheated. She didn't reach for it right away. Her eyes drifted to the open doorway behind him, scanning the empty horizon, then came back to the cup. Men come back? She asked. Not those men, he said, his voice certain. They got what they wanted. She absorbed that, then lifted the cup with both hands, her bandaged wrists still trembling despite her effort to keep them steady. She drank slowly, then gave a single nod at the plate, the closest she had come to asking permission to eat. He pulled a chair near the table and sat, watching her without staring. He could see the dark bruises at the base of her throat where someone had likely shoved or grabbed her. The shirt collar hid some of it, but the marks were fresh and angry. There were still so many questions she hadn't answered. How many men were involved in taking her? Had anyone else from her band been captured? How far from here had she been taken? But he didn't push. Pushing would only build a higher wall between them. Instead, he asked something simpler, more practical. How far was your band from the canyon when the raid happened? She hesitated, not because she didn't understand, but because she was deciding whether he was worthy of the answer. 2 days' walk, north of Water Pass, she said finally. Soldiers come late. Fire. Many run. He nodded once. He knew the area she meant. A landscape of rough ridges, dead juniper, and a dry stream bed that sometimes held pools of water after the rare storms. If soldiers had attacked an Apache band there might be bodies scattered across the rocks, or prisoners taken back to Fort Grant. News of that kind made its way to the town of Dust Devil Gulch slowly, twisted and distorted by rumor. He didn't ask the next question out loud, the one that felt too personal. If she had a husband, or children, or a father among those who had scattered in the fire and chaos. But something in the way her face hardened at the memory made him guess that she had lost more than just her freedom in the past week. She set the empty plate aside and wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, her breathing now steady and even. After a few seconds of shared silence, she spoke again, her voice a quiet observation. You live here alone. Long time. 12 years, he said, the number feeling heavy in his own mouth. Since the raids up near Salt Creek took half the trail crew I worked with. He didn't mention Daniel. He almost never did. She studied him, as if weighing that answer, then looked toward the door again. You fight if they come, or you send me out. He didn't move in his chair, but his eyes fixed on hers. The question wasn't angry or accusatory. It was direct, the same way a person might ask if a roof leaks or if a horse is prone to bite. "Depends who rides in," he said, the answer as honest as he could make it. She nodded once, not disappointed, not relieved. She understood more than she spoke. She understood that a man alone had to make choices based on survival. The silence that followed her words brought up something else he had been avoiding. What if her people, the survivors of the raid, came looking for her? He knew some Apache bands tracked with an almost supernatural skill, traveling silently through terrain where a white man would leave a trail a mile wide. If any of their scouts were searching, they might already be following the trail of the 3 riders who had taken her. His cabin, though isolated, wasn't far off a route used by hunters and raiding parties in the dry years. He checked the window out of habit, a small, unconscious movement. She noticed. "If my people find they kill you," she said, her voice devoid of malice. It was not a threat, but a statement of fact. "They think you take me for use. Or trade." He didn't flinch. "Then you'll have to tell them different." She looked down at her wrapped wrists, the clean bandages a stark contrast to her dirty skin. They not always listen to woman first. The simple, bitter truth of that hung heavy in the air between them. He stood and took the empty dishes to the wash basin. "You're not a slave here," he said, his back to her. "If anyone rides in, they'll hear that from me first." She watched him, her dark eyes trying to read whether he meant it, or if he just wanted to keep the peace until she was well enough to walk away. "Why?" she asked, the single word cutting through the quiet. He dried the bowl with a piece of old cloth. "Because I don't want another grave near this cabin," he said. He didn't add the details. He didn't tell her his own history of loss and failure, but a piece of it had slipped through anyway. She didn't respond. But her gaze shifted from one of pure caution to something quieter, more thoughtful. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was no longer the complete, wary distance of a cornered animal. As the light outside began to fade, he fetched his spare pair of boots, old and worn but still sturdy, and set them on the floor at the foot of the cot. "Won't fit perfect," he said gruffly, "but they're better than walking barefoot." She reached out and touched the worn leather, then nodded once. "When I strong, I go," she said, reminding him, and perhaps herself, of the plan he had set out from the beginning. He should have just agreed and left it at that. Instead, he found himself saying, "You don't go far alone. Not with soldiers and riders still circling these valleys." Her brow tightened slightly. "You send me to town?" "No," he said, the word coming out faster and harsher than he intended. Dust Devil Gulch was the worst place for her. It was a place of questions, of leering stares, of unwanted hands. He realized she thought he might try to hand her over or trade her back to someone else. He added, his voice softer, "You stay until you decide where you need to head. I won't force you out." She took that in without any visible relief, but also without resistance. She leaned back slowly, fatigue finally catching up with her again. Before she closed her eyes, she asked one more thing, her voice a low murmur. "If my people come first, you speak before they kill." He met her eyes, a silent promise passing between them in the dimming light. "I don't run from a door I opened," he said. She blinked once, then rested her head against the cot. For the first time since she had arrived, she fell asleep without simply collapsing into it. Caleb sat at the table until the lamplight burned low, turning over what he had just promised. He didn't know her full story. He didn't know who might be hunting for her, or what kind of blood oath might trail behind her name. All he knew was that the second he had cut that rope, her problems had crossed onto his land. And now, he would have to decide which of those problems he would meet with words, and which he would meet with a rifle. The wind shifted before dawn, carrying a faint, distant scent of horses that did not belong to Caleb. He woke instantly, not from a sound, but from a deeply ingrained habit carved over 12 years of living where trouble rode in without warning. The air was colder than the night before, a sharp bite in it that didn't match the season. He sat up, his hand instinctively reaching for the revolver he kept by the bed, and listened. The silence of the desert was absolute, but it was a different kind of silence now, one that felt heavy, watched. Niall was already awake. She sat on the edge of the cot, the blanket pushed aside, the oversized boots already on her feet. She hadn't spoken, but her posture, straight, alert, and perfectly still, said she had heard the same thing he had felt. She looked at the door, then at him. There was no panic in her eyes, no surprise, just a calm, focused readiness. He stood, holstered the revolver, and moved quietly to the window, a sliver of gray-blue light heralding the coming day. He scanned the ridge leading from the canyon trail. 3 dark shapes moved slowly along the rise, not close yet, but steadily closing the distance. He recognized the way they rode, straight-backed, silent, not weaving like drunks or scouts pretending not to look. These were warriors, not wanderers. He looked back at Niall. 3 riders, he said, his voice low. Not army. Not the men who brought you. She stood carefully, testing her legs. The fever was gone, her strength steadier now. She tightened the strip of cloth that cinched his shirt at her waist, a makeshift belt, then moved to the window and looked out, keeping herself in the shadows. Her breathing changed, becoming deeper but more controlled. She didn't blink when she spoke. My people. He studied their distant forms. You sure? She nodded once, her gaze unwavering. Raven marking on horsetail. Only Blackwood band ride with bird's sign. He hadn't noticed it at that range, but he trusted that she knew her own. The question he had been expecting, the one that had been lurking in the back of his mind since she first spoke, now settled in the room with the weight of a physical presence. Would they take her home, or would they cut him down first for touching what belonged to their blood? He stepped back from the window. You stay inside until I speak to them. She turned to him sharply, a flash of fire in her dark eyes. If they see only you, they think you hide me, or use me. Her voice was firm, resolute. I stand by door, not behind you. He weighed her words. She was right. If they thought he had kept her chained or had claimed her as his property, they wouldn't ask questions twice. Then you speak first, he said, making the decision. Name your father. Make them see you're not a prisoner here. She didn't waste time agreeing. She simply moved toward the doorway and waited, a silent, powerful presence. Caleb stepped out onto the porch, his rifle held in one hand, but lowered, the barrel pointed at the dusty ground. It was a sign of caution, not aggression. He didn't shout a greeting. He simply stood where they could see him clearly against the brightening sky. The 3 riders slowed their approach when they spotted him, their movements fluid and coordinated. As they came closer, the horse in the front revealed the marking Niall had mentioned. 3 black slashes, like the feathers of a raven's wing, painted onto a small piece of bone braided into the horse's tail. The lead rider was older, the skin around his eyes deeply creased, his long hair braided with small, dark beads and feathers. The other 2 were younger, one with a prominent scar near his temple, both carrying bows and rifles across their backs. They stopped about 30 yards from the cabin, their hard, unreadable faces watching him, their horses shifting restlessly. None of them reached for a weapon, but none of them relaxed either. Caleb didn't move. He spoke in a flat, steady tone, his voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. She's alive. She's inside. She wasn't taken by me. Before they could answer, before they could make a move, Niall stepped into the doorway. She didn't walk toward them, but she stood where they could see her fully, his shirt hanging loose on her frame, her head held high. The 2 younger riders stiffened, a flicker of shock showing in their posture. The older one's eyes narrowed, his expression a complex mixture of profound relief and barely suppressed fury. Niall raised her chin slightly, her voice clear and strong. I am not bound. I stand by my own will. The older man spoke then, his voice low and intense, the words in Apache. She answered him in the same tongue, her phrases short, her tone controlled. Caleb didn't understand the words, but he could hear the accusation in the man's voice and the firm, unwavering dispute in hers. Then, she switched to English, a deliberate choice so that Caleb could follow. He cut rope, she said, nodding her head in Caleb's direction. He gave food. No white man has touched me. One of the younger riders glared at Caleb, his expression making it clear that wasn't enough to wipe the slate of suspicion clean. The older man dismounted slowly, his eyes still fixed on Caleb. He spoke in careful, heavily accented English. You trade horse for her. Caleb shook his head once. They left her tied to my fence. I let them take the horse to avoid a fight in my yard. I didn't buy her. I didn't hold her. The man's jaw moved as he processed this. He looked at Niall again. You are hurt. She answered him in Apache, and he nodded once, then turned his gaze back to Caleb. Why you help? Caleb didn't dress up the answer. He gave him the simple, unvarnished truth. She would have died if I didn't. I've buried enough people near this land. It wasn't meant to be a plea for mercy, but the raw honesty of it seemed to land. The older man studied his face for a long, silent moment, then spoke to Niall again in their own language. Her reply was shorter this time, calmer. The rider looked at Caleb once more, a new, dawning understanding in his eyes. He said the words as if they were a test. She is the daughter of Natche. Caleb already knew, but he didn't react. He simply said, then it's right you came for her. Niall stepped forward one pace, a decisive move that captured everyone's attention. I not leave yet, she said, speaking not to Caleb, but directly to her own people. The statement caught all three of them off guard. The younger ones frowned, confused. The older man spoke sharply to her in Apache, demanding an explanation. She answered him in a low, firm tone, glancing briefly at Caleb but never stepping behind him, never seeking his protection. She was standing on her own ground. Caleb remained silent. This was her decision, her life. He would not interfere. After a tense, rapid exchange, the older man finally gave a single, reluctant nod, though the stiffness in his shoulders showed his displeasure. He turned to Caleb. She is not prisoner. You speak truth. He paused, his gaze hardening again. But the men who took her, where they go? Caleb gave him the direction of Dust Devil Gulch and the trading post to the south. 3 of them, one with a scar over his eyebrow, one in a cavalry coat. The one who led them calls himself Corbin Vance. The older rider's eyes memorized the details. He spoke to the 2 younger men in Apache, giving them orders. They would hunt now. Before they turned to leave, Niall said one last thing in her language. The older man looked at her, then back at Caleb again. He gave one curt nod toward the cabin. It was not a friendly gesture, but it was not a threat either. It was an acknowledgement. Then the 3 riders turned their horses and disappeared back over the ridge, as silent as they had appeared. When they were gone, Niall let out a long, slow breath she hadn't shown she'd been holding. Caleb lowered his rifle, but didn't set it down yet. She looked at him, her face calm, certain of what her people now understood. They come back, she said, but not to kill you. He didn't ask if she planned to leave with them the next time they came. He only asked, you trust that? She held his gaze, her dark eyes steady and clear. I stand with you. They see that. They know I choose, not forced. The question that neither of them voiced, the question of what that choice would mean tomorrow, hung in the quiet air as the sun finally climbed higher over the silent, watchful ridge. The Apache riders did not return that day, but their brief, tense visit had fundamentally changed the air around the cabin. The immediate threat of violence had passed, replaced by a quiet, uncertain waiting. Caleb checked his rifle only once after they left, then leaned it back in its usual place by the door. Niall stayed near the doorway for a long while, staring out at the empty ridge, not out of fear, but as if she were thinking through the complex tapestry of what might come next. She sat at the table and ate the beans he reheated for her, not needing to be asked twice. Her strength had returned enough that her hands were steady as she held the tin plate, and the dark, ugly bruises on her wrists were fading, no longer raw and open. The cuts on her feet, protected by his boots and the clean bandages, were finally healing. She no longer limped unless she stepped wrong or moved too quickly. Caleb sat across from her, the small wooden table a silent witness between them. Neither spoke until she had finished eating. The silence wasn't strained or awkward. It was the same kind of quiet that had settled between them since the first night. A quiet that said more than words, a quiet that didn't force anything. When she set her empty plate aside, she looked directly at him. They not take me unless I ask. He nodded once. I figured that from the way you spoke to them. She studied his face for a long second, her gaze searching, analytical. You think I leave now? That's for you to decide, he said, his voice even and honest. You're not tied to this place. If you walk out right now, I won't stop you or follow you. She seemed to weigh his words carefully, testing their truth. You say you not run if they come. You stand in danger. That true. I don't break what I say, he replied, the words a simple statement of his own code. She accepted that with a small, almost imperceptible nod. Then she said something he hadn't expected. They know you not harm me. They will tell my father, Natche. He will send word when he hears that I live. Caleb didn't answer immediately. His eyes stayed on hers, waiting for the part of the story she wasn't saying, the part that mattered most to her. When she finally spoke again, her voice was even, almost detached. If I go back to camp, they ask me to stay with them. They say I must return to the women's lodge. She paused, her gaze dropping to her own hands. But I am not the same now. He understood what she meant without her having to explain. Whatever had happened to her during those 3 days before she arrived here, the violence, the degradation, had changed her. It had set her apart. She wouldn't be seen the same way by her own people. Even their kindness would feel like pity. You could stay here, he said, the offer leaving his lips before he had fully considered its weight. Until you're sure. Not as a prisoner, not as a guest. Just until you know what you want. She leaned back slightly, her expression unreadable as she thought about it. If the soldiers from Fort Grant come first, I'll speak before any rifles are lifted, he continued, laying out his promises like cards on the table. And if those men who took you, Corbin Vance and his crew, come back, they won't leave here upright. She seemed satisfied with that, but she still looked at him carefully, measuring his intent. If my father, Natchez, comes here himself, she asked, he will ask you why you keep me. Then I'll tell him the truth, Caleb said simply. I didn't keep you. You stayed. Her expression didn't soften, but something in her eyes settled, a tension he hadn't realized was there finally releasing its hold. She stood slowly and stepped toward the open doorway. He followed her out onto the small porch. The vast, empty land stretched out in every direction, the long shadow of Scorpion Ridge cutting across the sun-baked flats. The tracks from the Apache riders still marked the dirt where the sun hadn't yet baked them out of existence. She looked at the tracks, then past them to the horizon, then back at Caleb. They will come back when they find the men, she said, her voice certain. They will bring proof. Then they will ask me again what I choose. You think they'll kill those men? Caleb asked, though he already knew the answer. She didn't hesitate. If they find them before the soldiers do, yes. He didn't argue with that. Justice wasn't the same for every man, in every land. She stepped off the porch and walked a short distance toward the dry water trough and back, her movements steady now, with no stagger in her step. When she stopped near him again, she said, I stay, until I see my father, or I get word from my people. If they tell me I must go, I will still choose. He didn't hide the question in his voice. Choose what? She looked him straight in the eyes, her gaze clear and powerful. To stay or to leave. Not to be taken. Either way. He held her gaze, a silent understanding passing between them. Then this place is yours, same as it is mine, until that choice comes. She didn't thank him. She didn't smile. She just nodded once, a gesture of profound and mutual acceptance, and went back inside the cabin. As the afternoon passed, a quiet domesticity settled over the small homestead. Caleb repaired a broken hinge on the cabin door. Niall cleaned the cot, folded the blanket with meticulous care, and put away the few things she had been using, as if she were no longer borrowing the space, but claiming a small corner of it as her own. When he said nothing about it, she glanced at him once, checking if he would object. He didn't. That night, she didn't sleep on the cot. She laid her blanket on the floor near the wall, opposite his own bed. It was a move that brought her closer to him in the small room, but also established her own separate territory. He didn't comment or ask her why. Before she lay down, she said only one thing more, her voice a quiet statement in the dimming light. When my people come again, I will speak first. They will hear me. He answered, his own voice a low rumble in the growing dark, and I'll be here when they do. The final light of the day faded behind the ridge. Outside, the wind was low and carried no sound of hoofbeats, no hint of a threat. Inside, two people who had been thrown together by force and by accident now shared a space not out of fear or necessity, but out of a shared decision. Nothing hung unfinished between them. No one was waiting to claim her. No one was waiting to drive him off his land. Whatever came next, Apache kin, vengeful soldiers, or a long, unbroken silence, it would meet them on ground where neither of them stood alone. A quiet that was not empty settled over Scorpion Ridge in the days that followed. It was a silence built not on the absence of words, but on the comfort of a shared presence. A new rhythm established itself, as natural and unspoken as the rising and setting of the sun. Caleb would rise first, stoking the coals in the stove, the scrape of metal a familiar sound in the pre-dawn dark. Niall would wake soon after, her movements no longer pained, but fluid and quiet as she braided her hair in the dim light. They worked without needing to give or receive orders. He would mend a fence line, and when he returned, he would find a pail of fresh water drawn from the well. She would walk the perimeter of the cabin, her eyes scanning the horizon, and return to find he had left a plate of food for her on the table. They were two solitary people learning the forgotten language of living alongside another, their separate orbits slowly, cautiously, beginning to merge into one. The cabin, once a fortress for Caleb's grief, was slowly becoming something else. It was no longer just a place to sleep and eat, but a space where two lives were being quietly rebuilt, one shared silence, one small act of consideration at a time. For 12 years, Caleb had looked at his land and seen only what needed to be done: fences to mend, cattle to feed, threats to watch for. He lived on the surface of his world, his grief a thick pane of glass separating him from truly feeling it. But now, he started to notice things he hadn't seen since before Daniel died. He noticed the way the morning light caught the red in the rocks on the ridge, the specific, sweet smell of the sagebrush after a rare night of dew, the sound of Niall's soft footfalls as she moved about the cabin. Her presence was a quiet anchor that pulled him back into the present moment. One afternoon, he found himself repairing the handle on an old wood-carving knife that had belonged to his brother, a tool he hadn't touched in over a decade. He worked the leather and would not just because it was broken, but because he wanted it to be whole again. He was no longer just guarding a tomb filled with memories. He was tending to a home, and the life that was beginning to grow within it. The silence was still there, but it was no longer the oppressive weight of loneliness. It was the quiet of a seed beginning to sprout in the dark, patient and full of unspoken promise. Niall's healing was more than just physical. The hunted look in her eyes was replaced by a calm, watchful intelligence. She began to bring parts of her world into his. She showed him which desert plants could be crushed to make a soothing tea and which roots, when dug up, were good to eat. One evening, sitting on the porch as the sky turned a bruised purple, she taught him the Apache word for the hawk that circled high above them, her voice soft but clear. And then one day, a sound echoed in the cabin that had not been heard since it was first built, the sound of her laughter. It was a low, quiet sound, brought on by one of the chickens escaping its pen and leading Caleb on a clumsy chase. The sound startled him, but it filled the small cabin with a warmth that the stove never could. She was not just the victim he had saved, nor just the chief's daughter he was protecting. She was Niall, a woman with a quiet strength, a resilient spirit, and a laugh that could, for a moment, make the harsh desert feel like a gentle and welcoming place. Weeks turned into a month. The fierce summer heat softened into the milder days of early autumn. Then, one morning, a single rider appeared on the ridge, the raven marking on his horse's tail clear in the morning light. It was one of the younger warriors who had come before. He rode not with aggression, but with purpose, and stopped a respectful distance from the cabin. Niall went out to meet him, with Caleb standing on the porch, his hand resting near his revolver, a silent guardian. They spoke for a long time in their own tongue. When the warrior finally rode away, Niall returned, her face calm, her eyes thoughtful. "They found them," she said, her voice even. "Corbin Vance and the one with the scar. They will not hurt anyone ever again." The news settled between them, closing a violent chapter. "My father, Natche, knows," she continued. "He knows they have been dealt with. He knows I am safe here. He sent a message." She paused, her gaze meeting his. "He is coming." 3 days later, they arrived, not as a war party, but as a delegation of peace. Chief Natche rode at the front, a man whose dignity and presence seemed to make the very land around him stand at attention. He was older, his face a testament to a life of hardship and leadership, but his eyes were sharp and clear. He dismounted, his warriors staying back as Niall walked out to greet him. Their reunion was one of quiet emotion, a father's hand on his daughter's shoulder, a long and searching look that spoke more than any words. Then, Natche turned his gaze to Caleb. He walked to the porch and stood before him, not as a chief to a white man, but as one man to another. "You saved my daughter," he said, his English slow but powerful. You cut her ropes when others would have tightened them. My people are in your debt. Caleb shook his head. There is no debt. I did what any man should have done. Natchez eyes held his. Many men would not have. Now my daughter must choose her path. He looked at Niall. You will come home with us, or you will tell me what life you have chosen here. All eyes turned to her. In that moment, she was not a victim, not a prize, but the sole arbiter of her own future. Niall looked at her father, her love and respect for him clear in her eyes. Then she looked at the cabin, at the land that had become her sanctuary. Finally, she looked at Caleb, and a small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. My home was taken from me, she said, her voice strong and clear for all to hear. Here, I have helped build a new one. I will not be taken again, Father, not even by my duty. My path is here, on this land, with this man. We will walk it together. Chief Natchez studied his daughter's face, and in it, he saw not the girl who was lost, but the woman who had found herself. He saw her strength, her certainty, and he honored it. He turned to Caleb, and in a gesture of profound respect, he held out his hand. She has chosen, the chief said. You will not be her keeper. You will be her partner. You will guard her future, and she will guard yours. My blessing is with this home. Caleb took his hand, the firm grip sealing a pact that transcended blood, language, and the long, bitter history between their peoples. The debt was not just paid, it was erased, replaced by the foundation of a new beginning. As the sun began to set, the Apache riders departed, leaving behind a gift of 2 fine horses in the once empty corral. Caleb and Niall stood together on the porch, watching them go until they were just small specks on the horizon. The vast, empty silence of Scorpion Ridge returned, but it was a different silence now. It was filled with the promise of a shared future. The cabin, born from the sorrow of one brother's death, had now become the vessel for a new kind of family, a testament not to what was lost, but to what could be found in the most unexpected of places. Caleb looked at Niall, her silhouette outlined in the golden light of the setting sun, and he knew his 12 years of self-imposed exile were truly over. He had tried to avoid trouble, but trouble had brought him the one thing he never knew he needed. He hadn't just saved her life. In cutting her ropes, he had, in the end, freed himself. A home is not just built of wood and nails. It is built of courage and second chances. It is built in the quiet moments of shared understanding and in the profound, life-altering decision to stand for another when it would be easier to stand alone. On a lonely patch of land in the Arizona territory, a reclusive rancher and a chief's brave daughter had discovered this truth. They had faced down cruelty, prejudice, and the ghosts of their own pasts, and together, they had built a future, one quiet day at a time. Their story is a reminder that the greatest acts of bravery are often the quietest, and that even in the harshest of landscapes, the most beautiful things can find a way to grow. Like and share to send this positive energy to those who need it. And if you want to hear more healing stories like this, click subscribe to not miss the next interesting stories from Mr. Storytelling channel.